Awesome. So Tessa, who is a UCSB alum from '03, which we're very pleased to have, also got her PhD at the University of Connecticut and now is an associate professor at NYU. Tessa, I will let you go ahead and do a little bit more of an introduction. And if you want to give us an overview of your new book, Jerks at Work.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm a social psychologist and I study awkward social interactions. So actually, this kind of all got started when I was a freshman at UCSB. I was one of those like overeager types where I joined a lab my first semester of freshman year. I don't know what I was thinking, but it ended up being kind of career changing because I learned how to study people when they're uncomfortable with each other, but they don't have the skills or the know-how, or it's not even normative to say what you really feel. So I worked with this professor named Jim Blaskovich, and what we did was we measured people's bodies, so their stress responses, their heart rate, their blood pressure, all this stuff, when they were doing all kinds of awkward things with each other. So in one study, I was a Confederate in the study, they got the women who worked at the mat counter at Nordstrom to come in and paint like a pork stain birthmark on my face and measured how stressed out people felt when they interacted with me with this versus just plain makeup. Because someone with a facial scar or mark or anything non-normative makes people uncomfortable. And so what we could see, it was really fascinating, was how they were overly friendly and overly nice, but their bodies were kind of freaking out on the inside. So this was kind of my introduction to social science. I thought this is what all social psychology was, is get mat counter makeup people to come paint your face and then do these interactions and really measure how uncomfortable people are. And I then kind of scaled that to measuring things in the workplace once I became a professor at NYU. So I studied things like how you give feedback to someone who's your boss, how you tell someone that they're micromanaging you or aren't great at negotiating, all these kinds of skills that are tough, that no one really teaches us. And I think while I was doing research in college and grad school and after, I had lots of jobs that really kind of mirrored these experiences. So I sold shoes at Nordstrom's downtown Santa Barbara. And I noticed that like this one man I worked with was a real kiss out, kick downer. He would do anything to like steal all these like rich Montecito men, all of their money and sell all the shoes. And there I was like kind of stuck just a little bit in shock. So I was noticing that a lot of these behaviors that can be difficult to work with in real life were happening in my own kind of college work life, as well as also when I was doing research. So, after many, many years, about 15 years of doing research on this topic, I decided to write a book on it, mostly because I don't think anyone gets this kind of training. Like we learn how to do our jobs. We learn the skills needed to succeed at work, how to sell, how to engage with clients and this sort of thing. But we don't learn the low level stuff. Like what if someone steals your ideas or steps on your toes or talks over you? What if your boss isn't so bad they rise to the level of HR caring, but they're bad enough to make you feel miserable day in and day out? How do we deal with these things? And, most of us don't get training for it, or if we do, it's punitive. You have to go to training if you screwed up at work and it's on a Saturday and it's with a bunch of other people who screwed up at work. At NYU, it's called Microaggressions Training Plan, and it's a real punishment for screwing up and saying the wrong thing. So I wanted something that felt a little bit more hands-on that people could use, that didn't feel like a punishment and that felt actionable and clear and specific. And that was kind of like my journey to getting to writing this book.
Awesome. Kind of going off on that, as far as, it's a great, I have the book here, by the way. But is this something, the intention to have it as a resource book, or did you see it as something that people are like, I have a jerk at work, I need to figure out how to deal with them, go to chapter 4, I'm going to read that? Or is it something that's kind of preemptive to have this in the arsenal so that when you're out in the world, you can kind of identify the different types of jerks?
I think both are true. I think ideally it would be great if we could learn how to identify these, spot them early, both in other people and in ourselves, and just in workplaces where there's a culture that's a breeding ground for jerks. So if someone had handed me a book like this when I first started working, I would have really benefited. But most of us aren't in that position. We're kind of dealing with this as they're coming at us, especially people at our career stage. So I also wanted to be a book that you can just flip to a particular chapter and read. And then as you climb up the ladder and you become a leader, those same chapters just take on a different meaning, right? So if you're dealing with a micromanager now, you can learn skills and strategies of bringing up that conversation, having that kind of awkward, potentially conflict-based conversation, but you might also recognize yourself in that manager. You might also think, yeah, when I get anxious, I also do that thing where I send people 100 emails an hour and say, where's my stuff? So I think at different career stages, you could see it in different ways. So it could be kind of like this preemptive detection type of book, but also just I need help right now. Please help me with this one person in this moment. And I think either direction works.
Yeah, that's great. And you kind of started hitting on a point. We got a couple questions in the registration around this, and I think it's something you get all the time. It's why you have a quiz in the book and on your website. But I couldn't help but reading through and just really analyzing myself of, am I the jerk? Some of the profiles of reading things, I would start to look at and kind of feel like, well, some of these feel like positive attributes, but then there's sort of a thin line between where it goes from something that's going to really help push you forward to tipping over into that jerk territory. So as far as kind of, knowing whether you're the jerk and if you're on that precipice, like what would you say to people trying to figure out?
I think there's two things. So the first is that we all have the potential to be someone's jerk, right? I think at least the types of jerks I talk about, with the exception of maybe the gaslighter, this is just like within the normal range of human behavior, but it's kind of the worst case version of that person at work. So micromanager, they actually do have strengths. They pay attention to detail. They actually care about what's going on with their employees, but put in the right environment where, there's too many reporting layers, or they're afraid of failure, or they have a boss that's not giving them clear instructions, kind of all the whys can really breed that behavior. So I agree with you that most of these jerks have positive attributes. And in fact, most of them have to have positive attributes to get away with doing what they're doing. They're very good at reading the room. They can figure out who has status and who doesn't. They know sort of what people's relationships are like with each other, and what they can say behind people's backs and not get caught, and what they can't get away with, and things like that. So they do have these talents. And I think recognizing that is really key, but also recognizing that we all have like an inner jerk. We have the potential to suck. And we just have to know what our situational triggers are. And I think for most of us, it's stress and anxiety either turns us into micromanagers or neglectors. Sometimes we're afraid we're slipping behind at work, so we'll credit steal just to get ourselves back up and get people to pay attention. So all these situational factors can kind of turn these things on and off. But if anyone ever asks me, am I the jerk? I'm going to say the question is, when are you the jerk, and sort of what form does that take? Because I think I have yet to meet a person who doesn't have any form of inner jerk potential, but I'm also not the most positive outlooky person. You could probably tell from my book, but I do think it's kind of within all of us to act out sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm going to go ahead and in the chat box, I'm just going to share Tessa's website has some quizzes on it, which are also in the book. So if anyone wants to take those quizzes, I went old school and was working through the back of the book to do my quiz, which was very fun. But it's definitely, when you're going through those questions, I think it's hard to look in what you actually would do versus what you would like to think you would do.
Yeah.
And maybe not always seeing that. I know a lot of the advice here is how to deal with your jerk or what you're doing. And I think there's a lot of examples of friends of yours or colleagues who have gone through instances with jerks. What would you say as far as, maybe you're not directly working with the jerk, and you're not the jerk, but you observe it, and maybe someone's not vocalizing it, but you see it. What are your thoughts from studies or just from your research as far as how to go about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. It's one about allyship and sort of what the best form that takes. So I think the dominant way people respond to that isn't by making the situation worse, but it's not by helping. So most of us just tend to be very hands-off with other people's jerk at work problems, and for good reason. So often kind of putting your neck out there, stepping in, being the savior to someone else comes with a cost, comes with social cost. What if you say the wrong thing? So a lot of us are actually kind of unsure of how to be good allies. And I'd say that there's a lot of ways you can do that don't necessarily involve confrontation. So kind of the first thing is actually detecting who's victimized. So we might witness it, but a lot of times jerks are very clever and they make sure nobody witnesses it. And so it's not by directly witnessing someone being targeted that you can help. It's by looking for warning signs in their behavior that they're being victimized. So for example, if they're being gaslit, they're not going to tell you about it because the gaslighter is going to create a reality where doing so would just be impossible for them. But look out for signs of disengagement. People who used to show up to happy hour no longer do. People who used to go to lunch with you no longer do, who aren't comfortable talking about their work anymore. Kind of pulling back and isolating themselves tends to be a really big red flag for people who are gaslit, for people who are being kissed up and kicked down and that kind of thing. And the same is true for teams that have free riders. They tend to be very conscientious, so they actually make up the work. So the red flag isn't that people are complaining about a free rider, it's that they're actually just overworked because they're overcompensating for that person. And teams full of conscientious people actually outperform teams that don't have free riders because they overwork and they do more than they even need to. So sometimes the red flags are a little bit indirect. People are exhausted because they're working so hard, or they're disengaged. And so I think you need to look out for those red flags. And then I'd also say you can confront jerks on the person's behalf, but it's not usually necessary. Kind of the better thing to do is change as many structures at work as you can. Like come up with rules of how we're going to write down the work people agreed to do the beginning of the week, and then the work that they didn't agree to do. Simple steps like that can help weed out free riders and credit stealers in ways that are better for victims than just confronting a jerk at work often is. And I think this is important advice for people who are confrontation averse, who just aren't comfortable walking up to someone and saying, stop bullying Matthew. You're being an a-hole. Like most people won't do that and it's not that effective, but think about what structures you could put in place to actually help Matthew with that kind of thing. So, this is a very long-winded answer to how to be a good ally, but I think there's lots we can do that is often kind of not within what we're typically thinking about. That's actually really effective.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's good. Thinking about the sort of silent signs, not necessarily people raising their hands, because that's probably, more common and good ways to go about that. At the beginning, we kind of talked about, some of your Nordstrom example. I know you pepper in some personal examples. Do you have any, I don't know, what's like the most interesting job you had where a jerk at work came out that's maybe not in the book or that doesn't come up as often? Because it seems like you've got, a few examples were really driving you getting to the point of writing a book about it.
Oh yeah. I worked on the campus. I don't even know what it's called. Do you guys remember the salad bar level that had those breadsticks?
Yeah.
Breadstick place.
Where we used the hub? No. Was it called the hub?
It was in the big building where the coffee shop was on campus.
Like in the UCSB, like the downstairs UCSB, right?
Yeah, in the UCSB.
Was that called the hub? There. Does any other guy? No, okay. Well,
okay.
We know what you're talking about.
I worked at the coffee shop there, and I also worked at that place, and there's so much micromanagement going on, and it was weird because you're just making coffee and breadsticks. But there I actually found this issue of too many reporting layers where there was a manager, an assistant manager, an assistant to the assistant manager. And it took 15 people to get through things to get the job done. But even in the breadstick job, I remember just getting yelled at because my breadsticks weren't twisty enough, and this person who was really striving for control and actually inspired some of my chapter on the micromanager who's doing this because they actually don't have anything else to do, will start to micromanage irrelevant details in your life. And I have this vivid, I remember twisting the breadsticks at 6 a.m. because I always had to open and just being are they twisty enough? Are they twisty? Being very anxious about it. And I think little moments like that usually are on our radar because we don't have big careers yet. We often kind of forget about, but they were very emotional and visceral. And you had this huge anxiety. I would have this huge anxiety going to work. And here I am, a college student, doing research, doing all this other stuff. And the thing that made me most anxious in life was whether my breadsticks were the right shape. And I thought about it the night before, and I thought about it when I got there. And that anticipatory anxiety taught me a lot about what the workplace can really do to us psychologically when these things go unnoticed.
That is a great example because if I was a consumer of the breadsticks, I think probably most people weren't commenting on the twistiness levels, but
they did not care about the twistiness.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, excuse me. I think the point on the micromanaging, and especially in that chapter when you talk about sort of, I think it was making up a committee, having a boss who is managing a micromanager and just creating something for them to do. And I thought that was so interesting because, you know, whether I've been in that specific situation, but I've definitely been in points in time where it's like, why am I doing this? Is this just an activity to keep me busy? I'm busy enough. And I thought that was really
or not even just you busy, but your manager busy, right?
Yeah.
They're annoying their boss. So
yeah.
your collateral damage is often what we find.
Yeah. And in that, just for reference for people who haven't obviously read the book yet, just that point is around with a micromanager, giving them something else to do, to focus on, and that can sometimes bleed through then to other layers. And so it's trickling down. And yeah, that I definitely felt that resonate. Just kind of thinking about, you know, different types of jobs, you know, looking at the coffee shop, Nordstrom's. I know there's some examples of like sales or marketing. Do you think certain of these jerks are more prominent in certain industries, or do you see it kind of going all over? I don't know, with your research or the research that you're drawing upon, if that focused in on any specific industries?
Yeah, I think it's characteristics of industry. So law firms, for example, have a lot of kiss up, kick downers because people are all clamoring to become partner, and only so many people are going to make it there. And I know for a while, Netflix also had this issue because the people at the top just get so much more than everybody else. So anytime there's this hierarchy where like a few people make it to the top, those promotions are usually from within. So they're not hiring from outside. It's all kind of this upward path, but it gets really, really narrow at the top. And that top has an incredible amount of power. That's kind of the perfect breeding ground for credit stealing and kiss up, kick downing. And this kind of more conniving stuff that requires you to do stuff behind the scenes. That's like a little bit more trickery based. I think, you know, Silicon Valley, they have a real problem with people being really lazy because they hire them often just to get them off the market. So Google, some teams at Amazon have dealt with this issue as well, of people just doing nothing and free riding because they're not actually paid to work. They're just paid to not work for the competitor. So I think it just really depends on the industry. So it's not the industry per se, it's sort of like what's involved. I worked with some pharmaceutical companies that have come up with like very important drugs that are fast moving. There's a huge fear of mistakes. So like if you screw up the Hep C trial, like that's just millions of lives and dollars at stake. And there you get like micromanagement. So if there's fear of screwing up, it's fast paced, the people are conscientious and they're smart, that will breed things like micromanagement. So it's more like, what are those traits? Ill-guided perfectionism. I think it's, conscientiousness gone wrong, right? And so you take these people who are real go-getters and they're promoted because they're good at their old job, not because they're good at managing people, which is like a completely different job. We shouldn't call it promotion. It's just like a different job. And they're not getting that training, and they'll cling to what they know, which is like, unfortunately for you, if you hold their old job, that's what you now do. And so that's where a lot of that comes from. So, you know, a lot of this kind of fear of failure stuff really leaks out in these tragic ways where I actually kind of feel bad for these micromanagers a little bit for those reasons, but the people that work for them are not sad. They're just pissed.
Yeah, definitely. Kind of talking about the research element. So I remember I did research studies for psychology at UCSB, but as the person who would go and get hooked up and get my $10 or 15.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed it because it was easy cash. And I always thought I didn't do psychology, but I thought it was interesting to get involved. So obviously on a university campus, you have sort of a plethora of students ready to get a buck. When you start to do research and you're looking at, sort of further up the ladder in various businesses, how do you go about getting research participants? Because that's just something I've always been curious about. Whenever I read something on, there's a study of this, how do you go about doing that outreach? Do you reach out to companies? How do you do that?
That's a great question. And I think social psychology has this like very bad history of just using undergrads for many, many years, but no one really likes that anymore. So I have reached out to companies. I've worked in collaboration with like consulting firms that have kind of helped me get into companies. But the other thing that we often do is like use programs that will help us, like web-based programs that help us just get, representative populations of people. So there's a company called like Prolific. And if anyone's familiar with like Gallup survey tool and things like that, that will actually just get you people that have like certain careers, certain age ranges and that kind of thing, that I think you can kind of piggyback on your relationships with organizations to do. So I've done some crazy shit. Like I flew to Australia, went to KPMG, brought all my physio equipment and hooked up senior partners of the firm with new employees, had them negotiate with each other while we measured their blood pressure and heart rate, and then give each other feedback. But I had to fly like, tons of stuff there and my postdoc. So that kind of stuff is fun to do, but it's a little bit crazy. So I think now it's more about like forming those relationships that are scalable. And I also work a lot with people in business school. So that actually really helps too. And kind of surprisingly, people in computer engineering. So I work with people who do AI and talent acquisition. We're working with like LinkedIn Recruiter. Like, how do you use the data that LinkedIn Recruiter gives you? It's all algorithm based. So there's much more interfacing now between business and psychology, but also computer science. So you have to kind of develop all these collaborations. But yeah, it's not easy. And it took me like a good decade to kind of figure out like how to do it, because, undergrads are just not representative. I mean, think about us when we were 18. Do we want like all this knowledge to be based on our 18-year-old selves? Probably not.
Yeah. That's a very good point. I think, you'd get a very specific type of jerk going from an 18 to 22 age population. Do you have any other, interesting or different stories from research that you've done in the past, whether it was for the jerks, piece or other research?
Yeah, I mean, I've gone all over the world. I think probably one of the funnest studies I did was in Abu Dhabi, because they have a huge expat population. So I actually went there during the NYU has a day term there. So during January, and we measured interactions between people that came from 85 different countries. So that was like super fascinating, because we would do things like, I study social status in class. We would bring together someone, say from Sweden with someone from Pakistan, and say, you come from a high status country, it's really great. You come from like a shit country, it's really bad. And highlight the salience of the Human Development Index for them in this kind of like, very sort of political stereotype based way. And then see how they interacted with each other to understand kind of global interactions. And what we found is that the people from the so-called high status countries kind of bent over backwards in their negotiations, and they lost because they made offers too soon. They were too conciliatory in their approach, in an effort to kind of compensate for these like stereotypes we sort of made super salient at the beginning of the interaction. So I think that work's important, because probably everyone on this call works in some kind of global situation, right? Where you're interacting with people from other countries that have different cultures, and there's implicit status differences between them. And so I think, like, for me as a social psychologist, I can't just study Americans or people from the West. It's really important to kind of expand to these other places, especially that have huge expat populations from lots of places. So they're super heterogeneous. So, I mean, that was one of the second craziest study I did, was flying to the UAE with all my stuff. Yeah. I did it twice, actually. Yes. And they had all these weird rules. Like, I have all this physio equipment, and at the time they weren't acknowledging Israel as a country. And so nothing could be made in Israel to like bring it there. It's just like you're under this kind of crown prince rule there. It was so strange. So you also learn a lot about the governments and how much oversight they have in some of these places when you go and do research.
Yeah, I think that's definitely, as an expat community, that's interesting, looking at how this interacts within cultures. And I think probably each of the different jerk profiles, could be looked at in a different way, depending on what culture or country you're in as well. Yeah. Kind of speaking around, I guess, going from culture to gender and diversity, as a woman who's somewhat of a leader in my organization in the finance function, I've gone through various points where I've been called bossy. Certain profiles that I think when I was reading here could have been where I seemed like a jerk, but it was actually just because I was compensating from a gender perspective. Yeah. How do you feel like gender and jerks kind of go hand in hand? One of the things I was looking at is, could you be perceived as a jerk as a byproduct of just trying to overcompensate in certain, groups of people, whether that be in a a male dominated field, or vice versa as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sort of one thing we know from social science is that there's no such thing as an objective behavior. The same thing, the exact same thing done by two different people could be perceived in very different ways. So you speaking up and say you hold the floor for 2 minutes and 13 seconds in a meeting can be perceived very differently than someone of a different gender, a different race, a different class doing the exact same thing. And I think often when we think about these behaviors, they're through the lens of these like stereotypes and things like that. So I think you hit the nail on the head that, we sometimes label women who are counter stereotypical, who are more agentic, as jerks, as queen bees, because their behaviors are counter stereotypical. They're often put in positions of leadership where there's a glass ceiling and these kinds of things. I think one thing that people don't actually know, or most people that I talk to don't realize, is that at least when it comes to gender, the way that women are treated differently at work than men does not vary as a function of who's doing the treating. So men and women are equally worse toward women. Women as targets, there's huge gender differences. Women are treated differently and perceived differently, especially in positions of high level leadership. But the people who are doing that to them are both men and women. So one thing that's kind of interesting to think about is this idea of having, all female leadership teams and stuff like that. That's like been very much in the air. And the research actually suggests that that's not actually that helpful because it ignores the fact that women are also the perpetrators of some of these things that we often kind of don't talk about. So I think that's kind of one interesting piece there. But I do think that there's also these barriers to things like speaking up and having what's called voice at work. So there's some great work done by this woman named Tori Brasco looking at men and women's behavior on the Senate floor. And she found that women will grant credit to another person in an indirect way to actually have that credit granted back to her. But if she tries to grant that credit to herself and say, like, that was my idea, that's my initiative, those are my constituents, there'll be backlash. But if she finds someone else on the side to say, look, I'm going to say this thing in 5 minutes, can you circle back around and give me credit for that? That's how she's able to get credit. So you have to do all this conniving bullshit to like get credit granted for you in ways that are often not true for people who tend to have the trappings of a leader. That's men, that's white men, that's men with certain kinds of accents, that's people with certain kinds of accents, so on and so forth. So yes, gender is a complicated thing. I actually studied a lot. And I think but that's often what we find is that women are finding these indirect ways of getting the same things as men, but they have to like play these games that a lot of men don't.
Yeah, I like that Senate example. That's really interesting. The way, that you have to work to get credit for something where normally you should just be able to say, hey, I did this.
Yeah. But if you do, you're going to lose credit, especially if you come down really hard. I mean, this is super fucked up. I'm not advocating for any of this, but this is just like what we have found is that women who have kind of figured their way around these issues, they will find a powerful, often man, to agree to give them credit a couple times in the meeting, not just once. And they do this enough, and then they kind of get asked back. So like Obama's cabinet had this like, kind of echoing thing where they would learn to just label the contribution to the person over and over and over again until it stuck, but they had to do it for each other. It's often very difficult for us to do it for ourselves.
Wow. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I think we're at a good point where I know we have a couple questions in the chat. I also want to, now that we've been, stirring, hopefully people have been thinking about what kind of jerk stories they have. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up to see if anyone has a jerk at work story. And then we can move into some of the questions. So if you guys want to use your hand raising function, does anyone want to share? Go. Thank you so much. I put in the Tessa's website in the chat link. I'll pop it in there again. We've got the quizzes there if you want to see if you're the jerk at work and how to be an ally. But thank you so much. We really appreciate your time. And like I said before everyone else joined, if you come to London, let us know. We would love to do a triple T with you.
Yeah, just to hang out. That would be awesome.
Yeah.
And I will back channel with you to get people's addresses so I can send some books.
Yes. Awesome. Thank you
so much.
All right.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.